again, I hope. And I hope that you can hear me now. That was an interesting one. That was a good start with quite a bit of fun noise. Good morning from a very dark and early Mexico City, and good morning to wherever you are. Welcome to it's called a webinar. I think it's probably a kind of a virtual chat. And I wanted to talk a little bit about children, and you can see that from the title, and talk about children, which is quite unique in our education system, believe it or not, these days, talking about children, because we talk about tests and about inspections quite a lot, and league tables, but not necessarily about children. And it's a kind of talking where we're at, what we think is happening or what we know is happening with children, and some of that may come as a surprise as part of the research that we've done, and where we think we might want to take that. And then if you've got any questions at the end, that would be amazing. And if you are a Twitterati, then @GrousGare apparently is where you can tell us that you're with us. So that's amazing. Let's have a quick look at the next slide, which is one of my favorite slides. It's when I was a little boy, and this story about what we want to be and who we are. So you can read it for yourself. My granddad, who is my hero, always insisted that I should be happy, and that's what mattered in life. When I then went to school and was asked what I wanted to be when I grew up, of course, happy was the answer. The fact that the reply was that I didn't really understand the question is actually quite sad. And some of the findings that we're going to come up with today reflect that in all those 900 years, because that's my real age, not much has changed. One of the things I'd like you to do for the next the remaining 35 minutes or so, is I'd like you to actually be a child. Forget that you're a grown-up, put yourself in the children's shoes, because that wonderful quote from The Little Prince, that all grown-ups were once children, but only a few of them remember it, is very, very true. We don't position ourselves often enough, first thing in the morning, be we teachers or parents or whatever, we don't put ourselves into children's shoes. And some of that, sadly, is very evident. You know, when you see in the UK, and I've seen it elsewhere, when you have these signs that say no ball games, for example, those signs are clearly put up by people who don't remember at all what it's like to be a child. I wanted to show you a little video that explains what we do, and then we'll take it from there.
I'm one of the few female pilots. I've been to America, Spain, and I love every minute of it. Air traffic control has cleared us for takeoff. Okay, let's go. People, property, and postcodes. I call it the 3 Ps. Hello, Mrs. Smith. How can I help you?
I have won lots of awards. When I was a school child, I was directing my school play. It's not a job, it's a calling.
A Romeo. They see surgery as an art form. It's vital to keep a cool head. Scalpel? I'm a bit of a petrol head. I could have been a doctor, but I prefer cars. What's not to love?
In 3, 2, 1.
Good morning, and welcome to the 9 o'clock news.
Kidzania, London, a city made just for kids aged 4 to 14.
That is it was an advert from Kidzania, London. I'll tell you a little bit about Kidzania because it matters a great deal, and why it matters is that it's where the findings come from, and it's where the research comes from, and the research comes from the children. One of my favorite signs is Hope Next Exit. One of my missions, I suppose, one of my dreams is that every school, certainly in the UK and indeed worldwide, takes away its Ofsted banner or whatever they have outside the school that tells everybody how outstanding they are, and that every school by its gate has a sign that says Hope Entrance, because What we should be for children is hope and happiness, and not stress and anxiety. A little bit about that later on. First of all, Kidzania, what are we? You've got it in front of you there. We are essentially a city built for children, where with a global presence, and where children are essentially the people who are in charge of this. So a city built for kids, where children do jobs, get paid for jobs, can spend money, can save money, can give money away if they wish. But the most important thing on this slide is the little bit in red at the bottom. Grown-ups at Kidzania are there to be seen and not heard. And over the years, teachers in particular have got quite good at that. So children are in charge, children choose, children decide what they like or what they don't like, and reason why. So in some of our evaluation videos, you will ask children about what they do like, and the most important part of their answer, I suppose, is the word because. Parents struggle slightly more with leaving the children to be in charge, and perhaps we have a little bit of a job to do with that. Kidzania is a global family. You can see we're increasingly growing, and one of the jobs I think that we have in this world of ours is, you see all those dots on those maps. We have to connect those dots so that children understand they're not just part of one dot, but that they're actually part of something that's becoming very small called planet Earth, and that they're likely to work for and with global institutions. But back to the now. What are we part of? What is our education system currently part of? I took this piece through a gimmick called Wordle, which essentially highlights the words that appear most in certain documents. This in front of you now is a UK government document. The UK government document clearly places very high emphasis on schools, very high emphasis on the word good, presumably that's Ofsted related. A little bit of emphasis on the word pupil, but child or children is really quite little. I think school gate might be marginally bigger than that. It's indicative of what we're part of. Our accountability, educationally, not just in the UK, but in most places, has become institutionalized. When we talk about education, we actually mean schooling. When we talk about learning, we actually mean being taught. Remember, I asked you to be a child. Please put yourself back into those shoes. So actually what we get is we have governments at the top who decide what should be taught. Schools become the deliverer of what the government has decided. We often call that a national curriculum. And then what we do through tests and inspections and all sorts of other means, we then find out how well the school has delivered what the government wanted it to deliver. And if you're really lucky, you get outstanding, and then you can go and buy yourself a banner. That's the banner you're going to replace with the one that says hope, hopefully. That's our education system. And it's quite depressing that you could have a long debate around that, and without exaggeration, that you would not mention the word child once. Now, I'm thinking maybe that's just the case of schooling, but actually, if you look at the early years documentation that is around, you will find exactly the same. So, are we child-centered? I think we try to be. I think in schools we try very hard to be. But my point would be that the system is set against us being child-centered. The system is set against us really knowing our children, because the system is set at a performance level that has actually very little in accountability terms to do with the child. I was very pleased when, admittedly for a little while with my eyes closed, I put our documentation, the Kidzania London, in this case, documentation, into the same piece, and found that children, futures and learning and the word aspiration were very high on the agenda. And one of the things that I say wherever I am, and I think we as an organization as Kidzania are agreed on, is that we do talk a lot about children. And we do talk about children's enjoyment, children's confidences, children's aspirations, and doing things right for children. We're not perfect, incidentally, and we're not the solution either. We're part of a big picture, and we can help to make things better. I think we'd be better at that if we worked more closely with schools globally and if Kidzania globally interacted more. But we do talk about children wherever they are and whatever age, whether they're 4, whether they're 14, or whether they're called Felicity and live in Sheffield. Hello, Felicity. How are you this morning? The other thing that, of course, applies to Kidzania, which applies less to the school environment, is the Carlo Rinaldi saying that the environment is the third teacher. So in many ways, you can talk about all sorts of things in a school and address all sorts of things in a school, but some lessons, for want of a better way of putting it, some learning is no doubt better when it occurs in the actual environment. Carlo Rinaldi said to me not that long ago, quoting Rose Malaguzzi, that Kidzania and organizations like ours have a capability of putting the possible on the curriculum. I've spent a fair bit of time traveling in the last 7 to 8 months and visited quite a lot of countries and spoken to quite a lot of children, been at schools and been to the Kidzania. And disturbingly, when I ask the question of children why they go to school, the answer quite often lies in that sphere of because I have to. And I wonder, deep down, when I put myself in their shoes, whether we perhaps have lost a sense of purpose. And I wonder whether that sense of purpose could be refound through experience-based learning, through utilizing environments that enforce that experience-based learning, and through essentially building in an element of what you might want to call calculated risk. It's quite good, I think, to see children at a very young age walking around telling you that they're engaged in an activity that they don't particularly like. I love that. What is sometimes a little bit surprising is that they don't understand that in an experiential learning environment, that if you don't like something, you can reason and think, but in the end you can stop, because remember, at Kidzania, grown-ups are there to be seen and not heard. The other thing, finally, on that front that we need to be clear about, I think, is this. Testing doesn't make anything any better. Testing is a Polaroid photograph of the status quo. I understand from my youngest daughter that Polaroid photographs are now back in fashion, so I don't even have to use the word selfie in that sense. But that's what testing is. Testing doesn't tell us anything, and testing on its own really doesn't make it any better. So I would urge anybody to think and rethink why they're testing, what the purpose is, and actually how much it really allows us to intervene. Because what is it we're testing? What we're actually testing, going back to that, is what we've taught children, how children have been schooled in that sense. How well do we know our children? Do we know our children so well that we know what their favorite crisps are? And the reason I'm asking that, one is because this one goes to a head teacher who once said to me that she thinks that she knows the flavors of crisps that most of her children like. Knowing our children puts us in a much better position to be able to accommodate their learning. This is not the sympathy vote, but this is the thing that matters. How can it be right that, in my experience, certain children have ended in the secondary school, for example, where this secondary school, something like 6 months later, picks up that this child has a real interest in playing the piano the clarinet. So they've been going to music lessons for an X period of time, and that has never really quite come out. This is one example. Knowing our children better allows us to individualize their learning, allows us to click into what makes them tick, allows us to expand their horizons. Some of those children who come to Kidania tell me that they don't like English in school. When you don't ask them about the activity that is the newspaper activity, i.e. producing the front page, which tangibly you can then take away rather than it being marked in red, all of a sudden the purpose of learning English becomes clear. Again, a simple example, but then I happen to think that most things are simple, and that one of the things that we as grown-ups do in education is we overcomplicate things. Focusing on children stops us overcomplicating things and actually gets us to deal with what matters. So how well do we know our children? It's some time ago we started looking at literally the hundreds of thousands of children, aged 4 to 40, all sorts of backgrounds that we get through the doors. And I began to wonder, well, I wonder what their first choice is. And on that bit of first choice, I wonder who then those children are. And I wonder whether there's a correlation between your experiences, your life experiences, and what you first choose, where the confidence comes into that, and whether that's a quite simple, yet to solve, complex story. So we did. We worked with an agency called Havas-Helia, they're data analysts, and we started in London, and we found over a period of time, we took 61,000 children from all over the country on a school visit. The reason we took them from school visits is because that data is less contaminated in terms of being influenced by adults, which parents tend to do. And we looked at what was the first choice of those children, and then we aligned this with government statistics in terms of the index of multiple deprivation, and we analysed where those children were from and tried to analyse who those children were. We just repeated this exercise with 270,000 4 to 14-year-olds in Mexico, and I was speaking at Bet Latam yesterday about those findings. It's quite interesting to note that 8,923 miles away, there is actually little difference between the initial behaviors of the children. So if you think about it, what we're talking about now is no longer 61,000, it's something in the region of 330,000 children. We are going to continue, incidentally, with this exercise. We have to remind ourselves that contextually this is being done as part of what I would call a misaligned education system. We have an education system that is preparing children for a working world that doesn't exist anymore, i.e. the reality has moved so fast, yet we are still teaching and testing to something that bears less and less relevance. One of the reasons we know that our dialogue with our industry partners, for example, in terms of what are they looking for in terms of employability, it is further and further away from DFE in the UK, from Offset in the UK, and from all sorts of inspections and national curricula elsewhere in the world. What did we find? You see a pretty graph there. This presentation will go on the website and you can analyze that further. And the whole of the research will also go on the Kidania Global website. But the key finding is that the gender gap is there. And actually is there in quite shocking and disturbing figures and percentages. Now, bear in mind that these are children, if I take the UK as the example, and if you look at a map, they're from all over the country, they're all sorts of backgrounds, they're age 4, they're age 14. If we look at Mexico, they are from 3 sites in Mexico, ranging from Monterrey to Mexico City. They are, again, from all sorts of backgrounds, all sorts of ages, gender, ethnicity, etc. The gender gap is alive and sadly very well. What we did find was that the gender gap is alive and well at the age of 4. Now, it probably, having talked to my friend and colleague, Professor John Suresh Blatchford, it probably is alive and well much earlier than that. But 4 is the point of entry into kidzania. So if I give you an example, you have an aeroplane, you have 2 activities in an aeroplane. There's cabin crew on the one side, there's pilot activity on the other side. Age 4, cabin crew, 70% girls, 30% boys. Age 4, pilot activity, 70% boys, 30% girls. In Mexico and in London, identical. At age 14, those percentages have barely changed. So we have to begin to ask ourselves some questions. The first one is, so if at the age of 4 these percentages are set, these stereotypes are set, for once, they can't blame you, the teachers, because we do that so well, don't we? We blame schools for everything and we give them every job to do. We have to begin to ask ourselves, well, who are the teachers? Who are the key influences on those children? It would then be easy to blame the parents, but you know what? When you walk around the shopping mall, when you watch television, when you buy little kids' magazines and books, how stereotypical they already are is quite shocking. So I think we have to think about whose responsibility this is. The question I'd like to ask about that is about the STEM agenda. If on such large numbers there really is little or no change between 4 and 14, are we getting at least part of that STEM agenda wrong? And should we be much more about role modeling and aspirations for children, for girls, than about purely the subject? Because the classic answer was, well, girls outperform boys in exams now. That has nothing to do with the STEM agenda. That has something to do with the fact that we've got very good at teaching children to pass tests. Not interested, irrelevant. It's so away. Disturbingly, between the 8,923 miles, London to Mexico, there's something else, which is, in my mind, even more shocking. And this is this, that almost all the girls, regardless of their background, almost all of them, regardless of their ages, regardless of their background, all girls choose activities below their age range. And almost all boys, regardless of their background and regardless of where we are, choose activities above their age range. Now, you kind of wonder where that sits, and we can analyze for a long time. Again, I think, put yourself in the children's shoes. I think the answer is probably much simpler than you think. Sitting in a park fairly recently with my coffee on a Sunday morning, with a climbing frame in the background and families out, I'm watching children, little children, go towards the climbing frame. I'm watching little girls go towards the climbing frame. Every time the little girl goes towards the climbing frame, you can see all the grown-ups going, careful, careful, don't hurt yourself, be careful. Every time a little boy goes towards the climbing frame, you can see all the grown-ups go, come on, what's taking you so long? Get up there now. That's an example, a simple example, I think, of what happens to children. If that carries on at home, in society in general, on television, in shopping malls, of course there is a confidence gap, a self-confidence gap, and probably an awareness gap. There are also, interestingly, some geographical differences. It won't perhaps surprise you that children who grow up in an urban environment, be that London or Mexico City, choose activities in the first instance that are related to that urban environment. They're comfortable with what they're surrounded by. Children from rural backgrounds or outside of the main capitals may choose different activities. In a sense, logic would dictate that's what we expect. What this research indicates is that the adage that children can only aspire to what they know exists is true. What it also does, go back and think back to the crisps. It allows us to begin to think about who are these children, what is their background, and how can we at least try as schools, as teachers, and collectively, how can we try to address that? If you grow up in a home without any books, how could you ever aspire to become a librarian or a writer? So there are challenges, not just to the schools, not just to the parents, but I would say, as I said at the Booksellers Conference very recently, I think there are challenges to the publishing industry. Why can't books be cheaper, more readily available in different places? It's about experiences, and it becomes, therefore, when we know our children well, it becomes our duty collectively to provide as many experiences as we can. We need to switch curtains, open doors, widen horizons. What experiences would we like our children to have? Aspiration and deprivation, there is a very, very clear link. If you really look at that, children can only aspire to what they know exists, then clearly your background, your context, let's call it that, will influence what you might want to be. Or indeed, let's not forget that, who you might want to be like. If you've never come across the notion of a professor and university in your childhood, have never stumbled across it either at home or elsewhere, that aspiration simply doesn't exist. So it becomes about how do we create change? Change we need to create collectively. We see that there are key influences from this research. We see from this research that the key influences are outside, perhaps, of what we thought, or are at least more powerful than we thought. We know from our research, and again, Professor Sir Blatchford's research, we know that children do engage with self-concept, with that occupation matters, and that children aspire within that framework and within their own context. We also, and please can I make that plea, need to think about children about being multi-dimensional. I think from an academic, we quite often look at the gender agenda, or we look at the socioeconomic background agenda, or we look at the ethnicity agenda. Do you know what? Some children fit into all three, and we need to be clear. One of the things that is clear from the research, however, if we look particularly in the UK bit, is if you look at the index of multiple deprivation, is if you are in a good school, you have a life chance. So we have, as educators in school and as schoolers, we have a big role to play. But it needs to be very clear from this that we can't do this on our own. And perhaps schools need to rethink how they interact with wider communities, with parents, with industry, etc. It becomes a bigger piece. So what is it we say to educators? Every child is everybody's responsibility is the quote you see. That incidentally, but don't tell anyone, is my favorite school. How do you affect change? We have a choice, don't we? We can either do more of the same. It's always struck me as slightly odd that that crept into education. So if I'm not ever so good at maths and I only got 4 out of 10 in the test, then the answer is to keep practicing and do more of the same, which incidentally is probably going to bore the life out of me and I'm going to get completely switched off. So can we think about knowing the children? One. Can we think about how do we widen horizons? Can we think about experiential learning? Can we think about using environment? And can we think about using wider resources? Personally, and I think I'm surrounded by quite a lot of people who think like that, we need to look at the world of work. We need to engage with the private sector and with employers in their broadest possible forum, because they too are part of this every child is everybody's responsibility. I would say, and can predict now, that when the examination results come out, secondary of course, examination results come out next summer, a couple of days later there will be loads of newspaper articles from people in industry that tell us that the exam results might be good enough, but you know what? Schools aren't delivering us what we need. Well, actually, do you know what? Come off the fence and help us make it better. Yeah, invest. Clearly, one of the things we need to do is invest earlier. Start a careers awareness, a futures awareness, a purpose much, much earlier. Because why would we, when we know that children at the age of 4 are set in terms of stereotype, why would we wait another 10 years before we start to seriously address those issues? And if governments aren't going to do it for us, do you know what? We can do it on our own. We need to focus on curiosity, on confidence, on creativity, on resilience, and on early exposure to opportunity. Once I take a child to the theatre, I can start to put the child in a position whereby they might want to, in future, engage with that theatre. What are we doing next? We're carrying on. We're doing more research. We're hoping to do it globally over time. We want to create a global barometer of children's aspirations. I hope that we're going to find nuggets in some places that we can use in other places. We will consult with all sorts of organizations and continue to do so. And we really want to build that barometer, that creative approach to social mobility. We need to keep reminding ourselves that if you only read the books that everyone else is reading, you can only think what everyone else is thinking. We should be forced as grown-ups and educators to put ourselves in children's shoes all the time. We're putting together a group of people who are going to help us think this through and are going to help us influence us, because I think this is not something that Kidzania can do on its own. We're part of a much bigger piece. And I'm very pleased that we're talking to a lot of people who've kind of started to say, of course, we will give you a hand. Policymakers, influencers, people who are directly involved with schools, education, parents, at all levels, in all contexts. This, it says deliberately so far, I think we're probably about halfway there with that group. But it's powerful enough for people to listen to and for policymakers to listen to. There are a couple of other friends too, because even that group of friends doesn't have all the answers, the think tank, so we'll be talking to other people all the time. Of course we are. And you will have missed, for example, the representation of industry in there. We've been working on this think tank and the friends for about 7-8 months. So we've got a while to go, and it'll be a moving feast, because children are a moving feast. I wanted to introduce you to my granddad. And the reason I wanted to introduce you to my granddad is because I started with him. He was the one who told me that happiness mattered. I also wanted to talk to you a little bit about him, putting myself in my own child's shoes. That sometimes children don't want to be a profession. Sometimes, and I suspect in a lot of cases, children want to be like someone. I wanted to be like my granddad. And I wanted to be like Johan Cruyff, and I wanted to be an astronaut. I didn't become any of those things, but wanting to be and aspiring to allowed me to pick little things. And I still dream of going to the moon and seeing the Earth rise. And occasionally, when nobody's watching, I still pretend to be Johan Cruyff. But in a lot of cases, I am like my granddad. And the reason I'm using these examples is that we as educators, teachers, other people working with children in schools and elsewhere are such role models to children. We have such an important responsibility in how we treat children, how we speak to children, how we allow children to dream, how we get children to learn, and how we get children to enjoy that. And I wanted to get that message across because all the talk about futures and aspirations in the end will be guided and facilitated by good people who care about children and who want to be their role model. And then finally, I also wanted to say that this stuff doesn't happen quickly because we're up against it for 40 odd years, and it's become worse over the last 2 decades or so. We've become part of this institutional accountability and no longer being accountable to the child. So changing this will be small steps, but we can all start. We can all start by trying to find out which crisps our children like, what our children's dreams are, and actually which experiences our children haven't had, so that we can start twitching those curtains and open those doors. I've been an amazingly good boy today because I'm about to finish on time, which is pretty rare, so that we can take some questions, I think, and we can take that from there. So if there are any questions, please fire away. You don't have to. In which case, let's go back to the presenters now. If I can do that, please.